Hey everyone, so this is just going to be a quick lecture on how to do overviews, what not to do overviews, and we'll look through a couple of examples for each different case position because what really goes into an overview depends on what position you're extending, obviously. And so the most important thing to keep in mind when you're doing an overview is brevity. So you want to keep your overviews pretty brief. You don't want them to be too long because it takes away from the line by line and uh, generally, if it's way too long, then it can interfere with like a judge's flowing. And judges can get annoyed if you have like a really long overview that just seems like very scripted out, not contextualized. That kind of brings me to the second point that's very important, which is you want to have space for contextualization in your overview. This is really important if you're just writing up like a generic disad overview, for example, because all of your impact calc has to be comparative. Your counterplan solves the case warrants have to be comparative. Your overview to topicality has to be comparative to their counterinterp, etc. And so all of this stuff means that you should write in elements into your overview that have like places where you can compare why the case like is not fast or why the disad would turn the case or what advantages the case solves. In some of these examples, I have like very specific overviews just to show what some of that contextualization might look like, but it's important to keep in mind that you want to have space for contextualization. In general, the thing you want to start off with an overview is your thesis. So, for example, with like the counterplan, it says like you start with what the counterplan does. For example, it deploys a bunch of micro bubbles that cover a bunch of the Earth's surface. And so, with that, actually here, let me also screen share into this call. Okay, so with some of these examples, you want to start off with having reasons explaining what the position does, because that helps sort of frame what the judge is evaluating, especially on the negative when you've read a bunch of different disads or counterplans and the judge is not necessarily sure what everything does. It's important to just have that at the top. It'll clarify everything you do. Next, you want to highlight any like tricks or concessions. If there's like a big trick, like a very niche reason the counterplan might solve, or like a uniqueness trick that they might have conceded on the advantage or the disad, then you might want to pre-script that out, maybe for a large portion of the rebuttals you give, and so you could put that into your overview, or for like really important concessions, that's something you would do in the debate. So you might again want to leave space to contextualize a lot of this. And finally, you want to have space for judge instruction. So in the security 2AR, there's like, I think the starting line is like, the 2AR will be framework absolves and case outweighs, and this will fail. And judge instruction is always important, especially when we have people in the back that may not be like as in tune with our like way of debating or style of debating. And it's really important to emphasize that in parts of your overviews. The don'ts of an overview: don't make it too long or too wordy. Again, if you're making it, can't emphasize this enough, if you have a really long overview, which some of these overviews that I'll show might fall prey to, it's important not to do that because it can make everything harder. Second, you don't want to do line by line in the overview. If there is like a big portion of the for example, if like on the case they have like a big press on why cyber isn't false, I wouldn't like at the top extend the cyber scenario and then like 30 seconds in the line by line then have to like re-explain your cyber scenario in the context of their impact defense. Instead, you would want to just like do the extension of the scenario on the line by line because it makes things way more efficient. Similarly, you don't want to get too stuck to an overview. If there are parts that you need to change or adapt to the debate, you should be willing to do that. And that's also why it's important to write your own overviews so that you know what's there, what you can adapt in line by line, etc. And finally, you don't want to make it generic. Again, contextualization and comparison are really important. It'll boost your speaks. It'll help preempt new spin in later rebuttals because it'll seem like you took those into account when you were doing comparison. In general, can't recommend that enough. So going to the examples, here is an overview with the miscalc app that we read on the nukes topic. So there's like an impact calci trick at the top that frames that inevitability claim about why nuclear war has to be mitigated, regardless of the probability of it, because it'll compound over time. Kind of like what we mentioned about highlighting tricks at the top. Ideally, you can make it more comparative. It is a little harder to do that in the 1AR though, because there are so many different like disad positions that you might be debating. But for example, if they just read a critique, then you might want to do more contextualization, etc. And like I mentioned before, with some of the line by line, with some of the specific scenarios, you'd want to remove some of these and do them on the line by line if they like read impact defense. It's also important to notice that these are like relatively short. They're like a sentence, maybe 2 clauses with like a thesis argument and like a specific warrant or like a reason why it's likely now that's based on uniqueness, etc. Which is like very important. And then citing authors, that's like a good practice, but just depends. Moving on to disads. With a disad, usually in an overview, you want to highlight the thesis. Actually, in this example, I don't have the thesis right now, but it's for the USMCA disad, which is just like a trade bill that or a trade treaty that got passed a little while back. And the scenario here is about disease. And so you'd explain sort of the top level just to help with all that framing. And then you have like specific impact calc. So standards like probability and time frame, and then like specific turns case arguments. This was pre-written for like a specific warming advantage we were debating in the elim, which is why there's not much like, it wouldn't say like insert, which is something that you'd want to put in a lot of your blocks. I also like to like highlight it in like a color that stands out, just so it's like very clear that that's something you should do during your prep time. But like for this example, it's like specific to the impact defense that they've read and has a reason why that means that our argument is more probable, and then contextualizes it to like a problem with their warming advantage, same to like time frame, and impacts it out, which is like this, like explaining why time frame increases the risk of intervening actors is like a good form of judge instruction. Then there's like turns case warrants for each like internal link they have. Definitely turns case is something that you would like contextualize later. But all of this kind of shows the type of like contextualization you need to do. Impact calc should not just be like, our like disease is more probable because like checks have broken down or stuff like that, right? You want to make it comparative to what they're doing. Again, can't emphasize that enough. And I would focus on places that are weak. So if like you read it like a disease impact and they have like a warming impact, I don't think like magnitude is like a very effective place of comparison unless like they've conceded impact defense or something. So again, important to both make it comparative and make it contextualized to the round at hand. The microbubbles counterplan, again, you kind of explain the broad steps the counterplan takes, and then the specific warrants for why it would solve. Generally, the overview has counterplan solvency. You also want to have like a sufficiency framing claim, just to explain to the judge and kind of frame why their solvency deficits are maybe minor or why they wouldn't be as relevant. Insufficiency framing is just the idea that if the counterplan, there might be reasons why the counterplan doesn't solve as much as the affirmative, but it doesn't have to. So if the AF is like a 10 in solving their internal links, but you only need a 6 to get over the brink of the internal links to solve the advantage, then it doesn't matter if the counterplan is an 8, because it only has to sufficiently solve the advantage. It doesn't need to be as good as the affirmative. And so kind of that's like fairly common, but just something you want to emphasize on counterplan solvency. And then this isn't in there because I think we read it unconditional this debate, but you also might want to have a judge kick argument if the counterplan is conditional. And again, if there was like a big solvency debate, you might want to put this on the line by line. Topicality, it's really important to emphasize your interpretation and then some of your main offense. If there's a big like, if they read like functional limits, for example, then maybe you'd want to put limits on the line by line. It's also important on like topicality to put in your overview some kind of like case list, because it helps explain and contextualize what your interpretation looks like, de-emphasizes some of their defense, and helps strike a good contrast, which is important in clarifying your offense between yours and their interpretation. And that is, again, something that happens round by round, because a lot of the times they'll have unique or differing interpretations. And so you'd want to explain your standard, some of the like examples specific to your interp. So you wouldn't just say limits, they make the topic really big, that's bad. You can kind of see why in like T plural, which is like you have to have a bunch of you have to defend like 2 or more countries, why we've said why defending 2 or more countries is uniquely important, gets rid of bad apps that are bad to debate, and a bunch of like tiny apps that are bad to debate, and impacts that out specifically to different standards that turn specific app standards. So again, this is sort of comparative, specific to your position, etc., and avoid some of like the genericity that we said was bad earlier along. Finally, for Ks, I think this is like the position most often that you'll hear people like say overviews are not great or overviews are really important. Generally, you do not want to fit into the stereotype of having like a 4-minute overview that does like no line by line. It is not great. It can be like a negative stereotype that harms you. And so doing something that at the top it is like very impact calcy, as you can see. So root cause, here this is still sort of generic to security. So maybe contextualize in the context of why you would contextualize the critique to their specific impact claims. So, for example, if I was reading security against like an Indipac app, I could talk about like historical examples like the Kargil War and how that was like a conventional conflict driven by like negative perception threat, constructed threat perceptions of like Pakistan by India and vice versa, which the app wouldn't resolve for, and how that results in violence. And so, again, like putting in examples of these while you're reading the overview is also really important. There's like impact calc, and using that language of this outweighs is really important. Again, there's like a trick here. There's an epistemology trick, which is especially important in like K debates. Something like security that has like a very big K trick, like epistemology, you'd want to really highlight that in the overview and maybe contextualize this. For example, if in like on the case you said like this author is suspect or like is funded by like military sources, you'd want to like highlight that in your review, for example, and then judge instruction about why winning just one of these impact calc arguments takes out the affirmative. And especially in the negative rebuttal, you always want to preempt what the tutor is saying. The overview can be a really good way to do that, especially if there's like a flavor of app you read this against, like the type of like extinction outweighs framework apps that we read security against. It's important to like, when you're writing your overview, take into account a lot of the different ways this might be deployed. And if it's only in a like small slice of example, so if you like write a really specialized counterplan for a case neg, then you'd want to take that all into account. So I guess that was kind of long, but just to summarize, it does vary what you want to emphasize based on each position, but writ large, you want to keep it short. You want to have specific places where you can contextualize it or make comparisons with the case. You want to highlight any tricks or really important framing issues for the debate, and do judge instruction while reminding the judge of what your position is writ large. If there are places you can do line by line, you don't want to spend time in the overview because it makes it repetitive and generally hurts your speaker points. And you want to make it specific, not generic.